We know that we're going to die. We think about the fact that we're going to die. Our mortality is always there, whispering in the backs of our minds, taunting us. My dog never thinks about that. Never once. There's no indication that my dog ever thinks about the fact that he's going to die one day. Nearly 4,000 years ago, in the cradle of the ancient Near East, a small and obscure tribe began to worship a deity they called Yahweh. What began as the devotion of a single people would, against all odds, transform into one of the most enduring and influential faiths in human history. From its early struggles amidst a world of rival gods to its emergence as the foundation of monotheism, Judaism would go on to shape civilizations and inspire revolutionary ideas of the divine, humanity, and the meaning of existence, leaving an indelible mark on the soul of the world. Today, we embark on a journey into the origins of this extraordinary tradition, the faith that began it all. Thanks for joining me for Suncoast In Depth. This is the course called Religion, the Human Quest for Reconnecting. And we're looking today at Judaism. Today, still a small, and some would even say, well, it's small. It's a small faith. There's only something like 114 million people that would consider themselves Jewish religiously. Yet this is the foundation, the seedbed, if you will, that laid the fertile soil for the emergence of Christianity and later Islam, two faiths that represent more than half of the world's population on the face of the planet today. So Judaism, this little tribal religion that started, like I said, many millennia ago, as they sat around campfires talking about these new ideas, talking about this Yahweh, they could have never imagined that it would become this monolith of religious faith that exists today. Moreover, this is the foundation for the faiths that have shaped human culture, along with other factors, for sure. Greek philosophy, for example, the Roman Empire. But all of that has shaped the most influential culture, Western culture, that the world has ever known. So this little tiny Near Eastern tribal religion has become the most influential faith ever, by extension through these other means. And so it's appropriate then for us in this religion class to take a good close look at Judaism. Now, what I want to do in this class is actually look at its history through its own theological history. And I say theological history because a theological history is different than a scientific history like we're used to today. The writers of the Hebrew Bible, of which there were many, and the editors that stitched it all together, they did not have in their minds this concept of a scientific history. This is a book that is filled with sacred myth, poetry, and some historical kernels. But how big that historical kernel is or how small it is really neither here nor there, because it is the faith that emerges from these ancient stories that shapes the identity of a people. And like I said, eventually over half of the population on the planet. and shapes the ideas and the identity of God in those minds. So let's look at Judaism from its own sacred tradition. It starts off, according to the Hebrew Bible, in the city of Ur, which is in the southern part, most scholars would say, in the southern part of modern-day Iraq, or actually it might be in Kuwait, I can't remember. But it's way down there in the Mesopotamian region. And out of this city comes a man named Abram. And Abram travels to a city south of, in the area that we now know as Syria, and then moves into the area known as Israel today, or Palestine. Abraham has come with this primitive version of this monotheistic faith. And as the story goes, he hears from God some very important things that cause him to move from his native land in Ur to this area called the Levant, or Canaan at the time. And so he takes with him these beliefs, and the beliefs of Judaism had not yet been formed into a Bible, a book. The stories hadn't been collected in Abraham's time, almost certainly. This happened much, much later, but he did take with him the beliefs that would end up in that book, and would eventually come to be known as the Tanakh. And so Judaism, central to Judaism, its faith, is the Tanakh. The Tanakh is made up, it's what we know in the Christian world as the Old Testament. It's the same thing, although the order of the books are slightly different. The Tanakh is named the Tanakh because it is made up of 3 different sections. It's made up of the Torah, which includes Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And then the Nevi'im. The Nevi'im, or the prophets, is made up of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, the 12 minor prophets. And then you have the Ketuvim, which is the writings. That's what it means, the writings. And this is made up of the Psalms, the Proverbs, the book of Job, the Song of Songs, Ruth, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, Esther, Daniel, Ezra, and Nehemiah, and Chronicles. So the first book within the Tanakh is the Torah. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. This is where in Genesis we find the creation myths, of which there are 3 in the Hebrew Bible. Well, some scholars would say 2, others would say 3. So the first 3 chapters. Now, it should be interesting to note that those stories were included. We can be confident in saying that those stories were included as they were remembered in oral tradition. All of them must have been highly revered because, and I say that because the editors of the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, chose to leave the stories pretty much intact as they were, including contradictory statements in one creation story versus the other. For example, in Genesis 1, the first creation myth that's listed there is it has Adam and Eve being created simultaneously. In the second creation myth, it has Eve being made after Adam from the side of Adam. So there are things like that between the 2 stories that are very different. The chronology or the order in which things are created is different between the 2. And I think it's interesting to note that they left those contradictions in there probably because the each of the stories in their own right were highly revered by tribes within the larger, what became Jewish community. So maybe they just wanted to honor the reverence that these various tribes had for their own stories. There's certainly some attempt to kind of meld the stories, but not much. And it lends some credibility, I think, to the editors that put these stories into what became the canon of Scripture. So in Genesis, we have all of these prehistorical myths that give explanation, like myths do, to the mysteries that people observe. People have always wondered, where did we come from and why are we here? And so all religions have what's known as origin myths for that reason. And the Hebrew Bible is no exception to that. But what I find, this is my own personal opinion, what I think is true of the Hebrew stories is that they go beyond, they transcend a simple need to explain the mysterious to providing for the needs, the deeper needs of human psychology and consciousness. So these stories are not only worth reading, they are worth study. They are worth meditation. What I mean by that is they are stories to be taken in and dissected and what Richard Foster would call subjected to the sanctified imagination. When we approach these stories, we are supposed to approach them in such a way that we are placing our feet in the sandals of the characters in these stories, because these are not separate historical accounts about someone else. Adam and Eve are not somebody else that certain things happen to that we can now read about. Adam and Eve are the symbols, they're the personifications of humanity itself and its initial interaction and relationship with God and what happened to that relationship as time went on. What happened to the harmony of that relationship as time went on. The harmony of the world and how humanity fell out of that harmony. And then the mercy of God as God comes in with the plan, if you will, to not only remedy this situation, this lack of harmony, not only to bring it back into the original harmony, but to build a new harmony that even utilizes the fall. So these myths are, in my opinion, again, uniquely wonderful for doing that. And so I always encourage people to not just read these things and think to yourself, how infantile. I mean, who really believes this stuff happened? You don't have to believe that it historically happened. It doesn't really matter if you do or you don't. What matters is that you really absorb the stories, place yourself in the stories, relate it to your own experiences with God and with reality at large. Okay, so this is what we find in the Torah part of the Tanakh. You also get some of this in the Exodus. Now, many scholars would say that the Exodus is not only a story, mythological story with mythological value, sacred myth value. They would also say that there is actual history taking place. So scholars argue about that. There's debates over it. I don't know. I wasn't there, and neither were you. Again, this is neither here nor there, in my opinion. What the story of Exodus tells us is the history of the people as they have grown out of Abraham's family and into this larger group over the centuries, and then find themselves in need as famine strikes. They go down to where there is food stores, and that would be in Egypt, where the empire has prepared for famines, and they can buy grain there. And they end up staying there in Egypt, and they grow into a great nation. And then they exit. There is an exodus of the people of Israel from that land, led by the prophet Moses. Leviticus, then, also in the Torah section of the Tanakh, is the law code and the sacrificial system given by Moses to the people. And then Numbers has a whole lot of, well, I'll let you read it. It's, in many ways, it's the most boring part of the Torah, but that's usually due to a lack of understanding. But it tells some more stories about the plight of the people of Israel and their struggle to become a nation. Deuteronomy, as its name suggests, it means the retelling, is a second narrative that retells the story kind of compact of the Exodus. All right, so then from there, we get into the other books, which are the prophets and the writings. The prophets are typically about the prophets emerging in order to correct Israel on their journey to what is supposed to be greatness and a leading of the nations, and their need to be drawn back by God's mercy and grace, being corrected by God through the voice of the prophets. And then the writings are, well, there's a variety of things in the writings. Perhaps the oldest book in there is the epic poetry of Job, which actually takes on a view that emerges from Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy comes later, but Job takes on what is known by scholars as the Deuteronomic view of history, which is that if you do what is righteous, then you will be blessed. If you do not, then you will be cursed by God. Job actually takes on that kind of thinking and says, no. That's not the way that reality works. So all kinds of great things. Of course, the Psalms are in there, probably the best known section of the Hebrew Bible to most people who know it, and other writings that are included in there as well. So let's go back then to the history that these books give us, this theological history. So we begin with the creation stories, and in the creation stories, what it has in common is you have God existing. The Spirit is hovering over the face of the waters. The waters, as is true in some of the influential mythologies that come out of Mesopotamia, in the Indo, also even going even further back, the influence of the Indo-European creation myth, which is kind of seen by scholars as the proto-creation myth that leads to the creation myths of all the major world religions. Fascinating stuff to look into too. But in the Hebrew story, you have a difference. So they veer away from the stories of the surrounding peoples in their own creation myths, because in those creation myths, you have the gods, the Anunnaki, creating the earth after they have warred with the personification of chaos, Tiamat, in the Babylonian story, in the Enuma Elish. And from that body they create the earth. Marduk creates the earth. And humans are basically created from the blood of a demon. And those creatures are there to kind of become stewards, yes, of the earth, but to kind of clean up the mess that the gods have left in all their warring. Their fits of rage, their flooding the earth, and so on. So in contrast to that, you have in the Hebrew creation myths, a God who is in control the entire time, and does not create human beings as an afterthought to clean up the mess, but instead creates this good creation, and human beings are the pinnacle of that good creation. So that's in fairly stark contrast to the surrounding religions and their creation myths, which all are a version of what I just explained to you in the Enuma Elish. So God creates, humanity is the pinnacle of it, and then we have that humanity in the garden. Central to Judaism is the concept of Sabbath. So part of God's what is illustrated by Sabbath is that part of the cycle that we see in reality, and therefore part of God's cycle, his way of being, his way of creating and doing, includes the Sabbath, which is simply means the rest. And so a time of rest. That rest is of supreme importance within the 7 days, okay? 7 is a significant number in Judaism, as it is in many faiths. In Judaism, it refers to perfection sometimes. It is in reference to completion, maturity, and so on. So we have human beings existing in this harmonious world I mentioned earlier. But at the center of this creation, this Garden of Eden, is 2 trees. One is the tree of life. The other is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Most of you are well acquainted with the story. Eve is tempted by the serpent, who is more cunning than all the creatures that God has created. And she takes from the tree that God has, the only tree that God has forbidden them to eat from, and that is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Now, just reading it, you might wonder to yourself, well, what's wrong with knowledge? Isn't it a good thing to know the difference between good and evil? And this is where you see these Hebrew myths diving deeper. It's meant to be written in such a way, I believe, that it will prompt these kinds of questions. Why is that wrong? Richard Rohr said in an interview I saw him on, he said, my goodness, I spent 8 years of my life gaining the knowledge of good and evil, order and chaos. It's not that that is innately wrong. It's that what this knowledge leads to is disharmony. It leads to a dualistic view of the world, and therefore disharmony with the world. It leads to a skewed understanding of self. It is not led by wisdom, and it does not result in wisdom. Wisdom can still come, but what the story tells us is that this leap into knowledge that was forbidden them has led to a sense of vulnerability in the garden, and that they had never had before. And so many scholars would say that this is the awakening of human consciousness, the awareness of their vulnerability in the world. The story is pointing to that awareness, the unique conscious, sentient state of human beings versus the rest of the animal world. We know that we're going to die. We think about the fact that we're going to die. Our mortality is always there, whispering in the backs of our minds, taunting us. My dog never thinks about that. Never once. There's no indication that my dog ever thinks about the fact that he's going to die one day. And it doesn't seem to be the case for any animal except human beings. And so the story in the garden, the gaining of this knowledge of order and chaos, or good and evil, is an indication of that awakening that humanity has experienced. But what the story then goes on to do is it gives a remedy. God comes in and performs the very first sacrifice. He pronounces the consequences for the disharmony that's inevitable now. And those consequences are dished out. Now you're going to work by the sweat of your brow among thorns and thistles. The food isn't just going to show up. This is reflective of what happened when we left the ways of hunting and gathering, where we were more in harmony with the surroundings, our environment, moving where the food moved to, and reaping from the ground whatever grew. And it was just there, provided for us, to the agricultural revolution, where we began to settle in and plant our crops and domesticate animals. And so now you're going to have to earn your way through the world. You're no longer at harmony with it. And that's obviously a synopsis of what the story is getting at, and a glimpse into the symbolism that it provides for what humanity has experienced during its short stint on the planet. So these are brilliant. These stories are brilliant. And what ends up happening as we leave the creation myth, the flood myth, and the earlier chapters, is we end up at the Tower of Babel in chapter 11, all the while following this cycle of rebellion, judgment, and grace, until we arrive in chapter 12, where we see the man Abram emerge. So Abram is depicted as a man, he is depicted in the story as really the first Hebrew. And he has a unique relationship with God. He leaves the land of Ur, as I mentioned earlier, and he does so because of his relationship with God. He leaves the culture that he knew, the world that he knew, typical of the hero's motif that we see in so many stories, to venture out into the unknown. And so he is the hero of the Hebrew story. He therefore becomes, by proxy, the hero, one of the heroes of the Christian faith and of the Islamic faith. So Abraham, because of his unique relationship with God, is told by God that he is to leave this land and its ways behind him and move on to a land of plenty, where he will give him the land and many descendants. I will make of you a great nation, the whole land of Canaan. So he then also gives him a sign of his covenant with Abraham. It's actually not unique to Judaism, but it is very important in Judaism, and that is the sign of circumcision. So, you shall circumcise the flesh of your foreskin, and it shall be a token of the covenant between me and you. It becomes something that is so important because, as the story tells it, this is a covenant that you will forever keep with me. Okay? It would take a different shape in Christianity, which we'll get into when we get into Christianity, but it is still a covenant between God and his people. It just becomes more symbolic in Christianity. But that starts with the character Abraham. Abraham does not his wife, Sarai, or I keep calling him Abraham. He's not become Abraham at this point. He doesn't become Abraham until God gives him the promise to make him the father of many nations. That's what Abraham means, the father of many, the father of nations. And so he becomes Abraham at that point, and his wife, Sarai, becomes Sarah. And Sarah is barren. She hasn't been able to have children, and he gets to an old age, and he's wondering, how in the world are you going to give me descendants that outnumber the stars in the sky when my wife is barren? And so the story takes on I guess I'm going to have to do things my own way again, just like we see in the other stories earlier in the Bible. And so Sarah decides that she will give her handmaiden, her slave girl, Hagar, to Abraham, and Abraham will impregnate her. And so he does, and they have the son Ishmael. Ishmael will go on to be the patriarch, if you will, or one of the Islamic prophets through which the Islamic faith arises from Abraham. But God says, that's not what I promised you, but I will bless your son Ishmael. Hagar ends up running away, or she's actually made to leave by Sarah's jealousy, and God goes on to provide for Hagar and Ishmael. But he has another son, and this time miraculously through his barren wife, Sarah. So she gives birth in her old age. They are both old at this point, and Isaac becomes the son of promise in the eyes of Judaism. He then is tempted by God, or tested rather by God, to make a sacrifice, and the sacrifice is to be his one and only son, Isaac, the son of promise. This, many scholars believe, is the mark of the end, the beginning of the end of human sacrifice, which emerged as part of the ritualistic practice of many religions in that day, seen as the ultimate sacrifice, the sacrifice of your child. And so child sacrifice was common. And this story, where God calls him to sacrifice his son, is written in such a way that Abraham doesn't seem fazed by this. Some scholars would say he goes out and he chops wood all night, getting ready for it, and so he's trying to get his mind off it, but who knows? It doesn't really seem like he really has an issue with this, and that it's kind of an expected thing. Although it is troubling, because how now will I become the father of many nations? How will God fulfill his promise? And so, like in most heroic motifs, you have these points of tension in the story where you wonder, how is this going to occur? How is the promise of God going to come to fruition if Isaac is sacrificed by Abraham? And so then the sacrifice is stopped by the angel of the Lord. And as I mentioned, many scholars think this is the place in history where you see the beginning of the end of child sacrifice and human sacrifice in that part of the world. So then moving on, from Isaac, he has his own children, and one of the kids is a guy named Jacob. And Jacob becomes an important patriarch in the story of Israel, and is actually where the name Israel comes from. Because as the story progresses, Jacob, which is a name that actually means deceiver, again, pointing to the dual nature of humanity now that humanity is no longer in harmony with the created order as God intended. So Jacob, the deceiver, is, like his name suggests, a deceiver. He lies to his uncle and steals one of the one of his daughters as a wife, basically, through this deception. And Rachel becomes the mother of important patriarchal figures down the line. But what happens is when he is leaving to, and by the way, Jacob has, as the deceiver, has stolen the right of the firstborn. He was born as a twin with his brother Esau. Esau means ruddy, hairy, and Esau was duped by Jacob into giving up his birthright as the firstborn son, and now we reach a place where he has Rachel as his wife, and he has some other wives, and he's returning to the land of his father, Isaac and Abraham. And as he's returning, he's worried about his inevitable altercation with his brother Esau. And so as he's worried about it, he sends all of his gifts across the Jordan to his brother. But he stops in a place called Bethel, which means house of God. And there he lays his head down to sleep on a rock. And supposedly you can visit that rock. And as he is resting there and contemplating the altercation to come, he begins to wrestle with God, or the angel of God. And during that wrestling, he is wounded by the angel. And Jacob says, "I won't let go until you bless me." And so the wound becomes not only a wound, and therefore a kind of curse, but also gives symbolism to a blessing. And his name is changed by God from Jacob the deceiver to Israel, which is a word that has a dual meaning. It can be translated as one who wrestles with God. It can also be translated as one who reigns with God, or the prince who reigns with God. Fascinating stuff. I mean, these stories go way deeper than a surface level reading can provide for a person. So again, I encourage you to dig in to these things. So he becomes Israel, and this is where Israel gets its name. So as was promised to Abraham prior to Jacob's experience and so on, the people find themselves in bondage in the land of Egypt. So they grew into, hundreds of years later, they grew into this great nation within the boundaries of Egypt. And they were able to do that because of the fertility of that region of the world, but also because of their favored status in the eyes of the Pharaoh, as according to the story, the patriarch Joseph, a son of Jacob, Israel, becomes the right-hand man of the Pharaoh. And but after Joseph dies, the pharaohs that knew him, the leaders that knew him died off. The new Pharaoh begins to abuse the people of Israel because he is threatened by their great numbers. And as the story goes, they are enslaved by him and used to build his great, the edifices of Egypt. And so the people cry out and they call for deliverance. And as the story goes, God hears their cry for help. During the time of tyranny and bondage, a baby is born, and this baby is Moses. And Moses is born during a time when the Pharaoh, as part of his population control, has decreed that all Hebrew boys 2 and younger are to be thrown into the Nile. Moses is born during that time, and so his mother places Moses in a reed basket and sends him floating down the Nile. He's found by one of the daughters of Pharaoh and raised in Pharaoh's court. So you can, in the story, you see the favor of God on this Moses. Moses then becomes the man who must leave Egypt. He finds out about his Hebrew roots. He murders an Egyptian because of those Hebrew roots, and he witnesses an Egyptian taskmaster abusing a Hebrew. And so he murders that Egyptian. And he knows that the penalty for that will be execution. And so he runs away. And he finds himself living the life of a shepherd for a man named, his father, who becomes his father-in-law. His name is Jethro. So he's in the land of Midian, and he begins to shepherd flocks for his new father-in-law. He marries there, and while he is shepherding, leading this obscure kind of life, and leaving the opulent life of Egypt behind, he is confronted by the Almighty in the form of a bush that is on fire but does not perish. So the flaming bush. And in that encounter, Moses is told that he will be the person, the prophet, through whom Yahweh will deliver the people. And the name Yahweh is used in that story, often translated as the I Am, the existing one, or existence. It's really, the Tetragrammaton is just 4 Hebrew letters, Yod He Ba He. So there's a lot of mystery there and lots of fascinating commentary that you can read about it. But in essence, it is the self-existent one, I guess. And so this existing one says, "Go to Israel, go to Egypt, and you're going to declare that the people of Israel are to leave Egypt." And so he does. And Pharaoh is resistant. And so he keeps going back to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh says no, and he performs some signs to convince Pharaoh, and Pharaoh has his magicians perform signs, and so he says, that's no big deal. We see these things all the time. And finally, the 10 plagues are delivered on to Egypt. The Pharaoh becomes harder and harder of heart with each plague, until finally the plague of the death of the firstborn of Egypt is visited upon the Egyptians, so that the firstborn of every household dies. And this finally breaks Pharaoh, because his own son is among the dead. And so he says, fine, get out of here. Take whatever you want, just leave. And so they do. They pillage Egypt and much of its riches, so all kinds of gold and jewels and so on. And they leave with flocks and supplies. But then Pharaoh has a change of heart. His heart becomes hard again, and he chases down the Israelites as they're trapped against the Red Sea, the shore of the Red Sea. And as the story goes, Moses calls upon the Lord, and the Lord separates the Red Sea so that the Israelites cross the Red Sea on dry ground, and then brings the waves crashing down as Pharaoh pursues them through the Red Sea, drowning a large portion of Pharaoh's army. And then the Israelites make their way into the Sinai Peninsula, and they wander there for 40 years. 40 years is a significant number. It is the number of wandering. It is the number of it is a number that signifies arduous wandering or suffering, and not just suffering, meaningless suffering, but suffering that shapes the soul. And so that's why the number 40 is given to it. So it's, if it is actual history, we don't know how many years they spent there. It takes about, if I remember right, 7 days to travel by foot from Egypt to the Levant, to Israel. So they wander the 40 years because they're not ready. is what the story indicates. They're not ready to enter into the land of promise. And so they must be shaped by their experiences in the Sinai Peninsula. And there are a number of stories that go along with that. One of significance is when God calls the people of Israel to the mountain, Mount Sinai, so that he may interface with them directly, as he does with Moses already. And as they approach the mountain, the way that God is manifest to them is this thunderhead, this broiling of black clouds, smoke, and fire, and they're afraid. Moreover, they know that the mountain, the base of the mountain, was fenced off so that none of the livestock could approach it, because if they did, they would die. And so they naturally approach the mountain with a lot of fear. And what happens is, as the thunder starts to roll in, which Moses hears as the voice of God, but they don't, they take it as a threat, signifying that their hearts are still far from the harmony that is required for relating with their Maker. And so what they do is they say, tell God to speak to you, Moses. And then, Moses, you speak to us and tell us what God wants, and we'll do it. And so this is the beginning, as scholars put it, the beginning of the line of prophets, where God utilizes prophets to speak to the people instead of speaking directly to them. And so Moses goes up on the mountain. He receives the law. He comes down from the mountain, but he's up there a long time. And so long, in fact, that the people begin to think that, well, he must have perished. You know, there's a reason we tie it off the base of the mountain so our goats wouldn't approach it and die. Well, Moses might have thought he was more special than he actually was. Maybe he's up there, he's dead. So we need a new way forward. We must stay together. We got into this mess because Moses pulled us together. And if we separate now, it does not bode very well for any of us. And so we've got to stay together. And so we must unite around a new religion, basically. And so they reach back into their Egyptian past, basically, and they decide to make a golden calf. And that's significant because the bovine is sacred in many, many cultures, and that extends way back to the proto-myth of Indo-Europeans. And that's simply because the bovine is exceptionally provisional. There's so much in the way of resources that come from the cow. And so they gravitate towards the worship of this. There are a couple of different bull gods I can't remember the name of that are specific to Egypt. And so they seem to be hearkening back to their days in Egypt where, yes, they were slaves, but they had what they needed on the table at night. We had meat every night. They were complaining to Moses about this before he went up on the mountain. So now that he's gone, well, we're going to go back to, we need to be led. We can't go back to Egypt, but we're going to follow this new way. And we'll let Moses' brother-in-law become the new leader, Aaron. And so Aaron goes along with this, evidently pressured by the politics involved, and they create this idol. Well, Moses then comes down out of the mountain. Joshua's up there to meet him. And Joshua says, hey, guess what the people are doing? Well, and God says to him, do you see what your people are doing? I'm going to destroy them. That's it. I'm done. And so Moses intercedes. And so he's the priestly prophet at this point. And he intercedes on behalf of the people of Israel, pleading with God, saying, what will the nation say about God if he destroys the people that he rescued? And so it says that the Lord repented. Yahweh repented. And so you can see in these stories that this kind of evolution of the concepts of divinity, right? None of us today would think that God's mind can be changed, right? if you really think about it. But back in those ancient times, that was a very common thought. In fact, the minds of deities were changed by ritual. Again, going all the way back to the Indo-European myth. And so ritual and sacrifice was central to all that. And so those things existed in order to manipulate the deities, the different gods and goddesses. And so that kind of thinking was common then. And so the story in the Bible says that God, okay, I'll change my mind. You've convinced me, Moses. But later on, as the concept of the divine ultimate, God, evolves, it becomes more and more sophisticated over time. And I would say becomes more and more aligned with what is reasonable about an all-powerful creator. So that's just an interesting side note. And so God relents, and he does not destroy all the people. He just destroys a portion of them, and the biggest complainers, if you will. And then the people continue their wandering until finally the generation that gave way to idolatry, the worship of this calf, they've died off because they cannot enter into the promised land. And Moses is part of that generation, and so Moses cannot enter into the promised land. And it's left up to the younger generation of Joshua's and Caleb's generation to kind of elevated heroes at this point. Moses dies as he peers into the promised land up on the mountain, but he cannot cross the Jordan. The people of Israel then make their way across the Jordan, carrying what again is central to the Jewish faith, the Ark of the Covenant. And so the Ark was constructed while they were in the wilderness, according to specific instructions given by Yahweh, and this becomes the focus of power, God's power and God's provision for them. So it becomes the center of their devotion and reliance upon Yahweh. And it's basically a gold-coated box with gold-coated staves, and it's carried on the shoulders of Levites, priests, and then it will eventually was placed in the tabernacle, the tent of God's dwelling while they were a wandering people, and later when the temple is built, will be placed in the Holy of Holies, the holiest place inside the temple. So the Ark of the Covenant is carried across the Jordan River. The Jordan splits, and again they cross on dry ground. And so this, for many scholars, is a second baptism. First baptism was through the Red Sea. The second baptism into the Promised Land is in the Jordan. And so they cross into the Promised Land of Canaan, and they begin their conquest of Canaan, city by city. And as the story goes, they end up conquering most of the places that they attack, and this is by virtue of the power of God with them through the Ark of the Covenant. This has led to all kinds of wild ideas about the Ark, that the Ark was some kind of weapon, radioactive device or something. Interesting stuff to look into, but anyway, the Bible doesn't indicate that really. It's just the symbol of God's presence with the people. And so they conquer the existing peoples in the area, and they are told not to integrate with them, but the people, as is the habit of humanity, do not listen to Yahweh fully, and they end up integrating with the existing cultures in many ways, including the worship of the local gods and goddesses. And this becomes a point of contention between the people and God. And so they have to be chastised for it. Again, you see the cycle of rebellion or sin, judgment, and then grace. So what happens? Well, they go in there, they integrate with the peoples, and this leads to the Assyrian Empire being allowed by God to come in and take part of the nation away. So Israel develops in the conquered land over time. They reach their glory days under the rule of King David, who is a messianic figure in Judaism. They are kind of at the pinnacle. Their golden age is the Davidic period. Then Solomon, his son, becomes king when David dies, and the golden age kind of continues. But Solomon is given to his lusts, and as the story goes, he marries so many wives, and like a 1,000 concubines, 700 wives, and so on, and in the process, adopts the worship of some of their gods. And this leads eventually to the empire weakening, the Jewish kingdom weakening, and under Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, who inherits the throne, the people of the tribes of the northern kingdom end up separating because they feel abused and neglected by Rehoboam in the south. And so they become a separate nation, the nation of Israel in the north, the nation of Judah in the south. Well, because of the sins of the north, as the story goes, the sins of many of the kings of the north, all of which was written by prophets in the south, by the way, they eventually fall victim to the Assyrian Empire. So the Assyrian Empire comes in and they take away the best and brightest of Israel, and the northern tribes cease to exist as actual separate identities. They lose their identity as the various tribes of the north. Judah, however, continues because it's more faithful than the northern tribes were, and so they're spared for a while. But then they fall into problematic behavior, and they rebel in their own way against Yahweh. And so eventually then the Babylonian Empire sweeps away the kingdom of Judah and takes away its best and brightest into the land of Babylon, which is probably, at least according to many scholars, where the oral traditions of Judaism and the various texts that had arisen from those oral traditions were edited together into what is known as the Hebrew Bible today. As a result of the Babylonian invasion, the temple that was built by King Solomon is destroyed, and the religious identity of the Jews is thrown into crisis. They're not only were they taken away from the temple, but they were taken away from the land. They were in the temple. The center of the worship of Yahweh is destroyed. Something they thought was absolutely impossible. This is the house of God. How would God ever let this happen? He must have forsaken us altogether. And so the efforts of the leadership Jewish leadership in Babylon was to keep the people united, to keep them grounded in their faith as best they could. And so there was a strong nationalism that was created in their Babylonian captivity. Eventually, the kingdom of Babylon falls to Cyrus the Great, a Persian king, and the Persian Empire takes over. And Cyrus, given to the teachings probably of Zoroastrianism, which was also a kind of monotheistic religion, very dualistic compared to Israel's religion, but was sympathetic toward the Jews and allows for the people to return to the land if they would like to. Many had assimilated into Mesopotamian culture and did not want to go back, but there was a remnant that wanted to return. And so Cyrus allowed it, and that remnant went back, and that begins the Second Temple period. And I'm going to leave off there. This is the period in Israel's history where they're trying to determine what it means to be faithful so that we don't have these calamities constantly coming upon us as we disobey Yahweh. We have to figure out how to purify ourselves so that these things stop happening. And this is where we see Judaism beginning to shape into what we know today in Judaism. So the beginnings of that, the beginnings of the Judaism that set the stage for Jesus of Nazareth. So we'll leave off here at the Second Temple and their efforts to do that, and we'll follow up with a second class that looks at the history from that point through to the intertestamental period to the time of Jesus in the first century. Thanks for watching.